Good morning, everybody. Well, in Washington, D.C. is already noon, but I'm now in Mexico City, not in San Diego. So my name is Rafael Fernandez de Castro. I'm the director of the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies at UC San Diego. And I welcome you all to this webinar about, what is the role of Mexico in the U.S. presidential campaign 2024? We're lucky to have such a wonderful panelist, Sergio Alcocer. This is organized by the Consejo Mexicano de Asuntos Internacionales, COMEXI, and by the Center of U.S.-Mexican Studies at UCSD. And so I will give the floor to Sergio Alcocer to introduce the panelists. Sergio, yours is the floor. Just before I give the floor to Sergio, let me remind you, everybody, that we want this to be very interactive. So we have a Q&A button there. Please use it. Send the questions to our panelists, and they will be ready to answer it to you. Sergio Alcocer, please.
Muchas gracias, Rafael. Pues muy buenos días y muy buenas tardes hasta Washington. Para mí es un placer poder presentar a nuestros panelistas. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos. Kathleen Bruhn, quien se especializa en el estudio de política comparada, identidad de estudios latinoamericanos en la Universidad de California, en el plantel de Santa Bárbara. Sus líneas de investigación incluyen la democratización por partidos políticos y la movilización social. Su último libro se titula en español Política y la, digamos, Marea Rosa, que se va a publicar próximamente en University of Notre Dame Press. Examina cómo las políticas económicas y las estructuras de los partidos políticos afectan las protestas o las manifestaciones, así como también las políticas alrededor de las manifestaciones en 5 países de América Latina. Ella ha publicado de manera muy amplia acerca de las elecciones en nuestro país, las campañas, los efectos de las primarias de los diversos partidos políticos, así como de la izquierda mexicana. Kathleen, muy bienvenida, muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Me da mucho gusto también dar la bienvenida a María Echaveste, una destacada académica de la Universidad de California, en el plantel, en este caso, de Berkeley. Ella actualmente es la presidenta del Instituto de las Oportunidades, Opportunity Institute, en donde encabeza las diversas actividades de liderazgo dentro del instituto. Ella ha tenido una actividad muy amplia, como mencionaba, en la Universidad de California, en Berkeley, tanto en el ámbito de la Escuela de Leyes, como también en el Instituto de la propia universidad acerca de seguridad alimentaria. Tuvo la oportunidad de trabajar en la administración del presidente Clinton, directamente encargada de la operación de la Casa Blanca, y además con una señalada participación en la política del gobierno estadounidense hacia México y hacia América Latina. Actualmente ella tiene diversas actividades en la Universidad de California de San Francisco como miembro de la junta directiva de uno de los hospitales. Ella estudió antropología en la Universidad de Stanford y posteriormente obtuvo un doctorado en leyes en la Universidad de California en Berkeley. Y nuestro tercer invitado es el ex embajador de los Estados Unidos en México, el embajador Christopher Landau, quien también es abogado. Él estudió leyes en la Universidad de Harvard. Posteriormente trabajó en varias repetidas ocasiones, un par de ocasiones en la Suprema Corte, dentro del grupo de juristas que apoyaron en su momento al ministro Antonio Scalia, así como también al ministro Clarence Thomas. Actualmente él es abogado en la firma Ellis George en la ciudad de Washington, D.C. y, como mencioné, fue el embajador de los Estados Unidos en México entre el año 2019 y 2021, con una actividad muy amplia, muy reconocida por todos en México, muy particularmente su participación en las redes sociales, que creo que abrió un hito en nuestro país de los embajadores, haciendo referencia a sus diversas actividades en las redes sociales. Embajador Landau, muy bienvenido. Pues muy bienvenidos Kathleen, María y Christopher. Y adelante, Rafael.
Thank you, Sergio. Wonderful to have you, and I believe to have an academic and to have two former diplomat, former policymaker is wonderful. I believe we have a good balance here, and For all purposes, Chris, Maria, and Kate, I believe that, I mean, the primary season is over. We have two candidates, and we have Super Tuesday last Tuesday, and Donald Trump did very well as Biden. And yesterday we listened to this State of the Union, and it was clearly, I mean, the beginning of a presidential campaign. So let me start with you, Chris. What is your take on this? We're seeing a rematch of 2020. How do you feel about it? And what are the things that we want to be looking at? And so let's talk first about US politics, and then we'll talk about, because the mission of this webinar is to talk about Mexico and the US-Mexican issues within the campaign. But let's start about politics, about the moment we're living right now. And thank you, Chris, again for being with us. Please go ahead.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, Rafael. Thank you for that introduction to you and to Sergio, and thanks to both to COMEXI and the Center for U.S.-Mexico Relations at UCSD. It's just a pleasure to be back with old friends again and to talk about these issues that are really so important in both countries. Let me just say, in terms of the U.S. election, I think what's really extraordinary here is that we're going to have two incumbent presidents running against each other for the first time in more than 100 years, since Theodore Roosevelt tried to run for re-election in 1912 to succeed the man that he had handpicked for president in 1908, President Taft. And then Woodrow Wilson, of course, won that election. But here we're going to have two past presidents with records as president. I mean, typically when you have an incumbent and a challenger, the challenger is promising all kinds of stuff that he's going to do differently. Here, both of them have a record of 4 years as president, and the American people can look at those records and compare. And so I think it's going to be a very different campaign than we are used to. I think a lot of people, are a little bit surprised that we wound up in this place, given that there are high negatives for both candidates. But we had, as you just said, Rafael, a primary season that, at least on the Republican side, was very vigorous. And, a whole variety of a menu of different choices of different kinds of candidates. And Donald Trump clearly came out on top of that. There was really nothing ambiguous about that. So, I think another, just a final point that we shouldn't lose sight of, even though the two main candidates are set, I still think one wild card remains the third party issue. And I think it could be significant in this election. I don't know that, but, obviously Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is running as an independent, and, we may see other third party candidates in this election. So I honestly predict this is going to be a wild ride of a year, and anybody who says that they know how it's all going to end up is smoking something that they're not supposed to be.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, anything but predictable. Beautiful. Maria, let's go with you. I mean, you've been in presidential campaigns. You were very close to Hillary, and I remember vividly that at a time you were working for the Hillary campaign and your husband was working for Obama's campaign. That was very telling in your family. So Maria, give us your sense, your take on this, how you see this rematch, Biden-Trump.
Well, I think that the 3 points I would make is that it's a rematch that for a great number of people did not want. And it's unfortunate. I find myself in various settings getting people coming up to me, look, why? And why did Biden run? And why do we have to do this again? And I keep saying that Biden had worked his entire life to be president. And he succeeded in that close election in 2020. And he has a track record. And the fact is that his State of the Union yesterday showed a level of energy that many of us were hoping to see. So no one really gives up power. And he's got a lot to do. And he really believes that he's the one who can take on former President Trump. So we have a rematch that a lot of people didn't want. Number two, what's more really going to get played out, I think, is that difference in vision for the country. an optimistic view about where this country is going versus, I would say, former President Trump's darker vision. And that's going to get played out. And I would say one of the things that I've learned from working with President Clinton was that elections are about the future. They're about the future, and who is able to describe a future that more people will want to invest in? That's going to be the trick. And obviously, I have a particular view. But the third thing is, this election is not happening and never happens in a vacuum. And we cannot ignore both the war in Ukraine, the Middle East, and the impact that Gaza will have on a part of the coalition that brought Biden to the White House. And that, I really feel, has to be paid close attention, because Michigan will be in play, but young people across, young Latinos, are very pro-Palestinian. So this is going to be tricky. So yes, this election is about the United States and its future, but you cannot ignore the external, the foreign, and obviously immigration in Mexico, this is why we're here today, is hugely relevant as well.
Thank you, Maria. Kate, what is your take on this? You're one of the academics in the US who has been very attentive to Mexico and Mexican affairs. So if you give us a sense of how you feel about this rematch, but also if you would like to start introducing the topic, how you feel that Mexico role will be in this campaign. And let me remind everybody, les recuerdo a todo mundo, that there's a Q&A button, hay un botón ahí de preguntas y respuestas. Envíenos sus respuestas. Please send us your questions, your comments, because we want to do this webinar as interactive as possible. Kate, please, yours is the floor, and I will give the floor to Sergio.
Well, I wanted to start with a couple of points about the U.S. election, and then start to talk about Mexico's role in it. One of which is that while these are presidents who both have records, the memories of Trump are older than the memories of Biden. And so in many ways, I think it still is an election about the incumbent's record, and not about what people remember of Trump. I think those memories may have faded a little bit. His absence from Twitter may have caused people to not pay as much attention outside of his base. And so when we talk about issues like immigration, I'm not sure to what extent people actually remember the separation of families at the border, to what degree they remember the Muslim ban, to what degree they remember the building of the wall, the attempts to build the wall. It's a very big talking point on the Republican side, but I'm not sure to what degree independents really have incorporated that in their memories. I remain surprised that despite all of President Trump's legal difficulties, he remains as popular or more popular than ever. In fact, the beginning of his legal difficulties was also the beginning of his surge in the polls. So it does strike me that we can't ignore what's going on with those cases. I personally doubt that they will be resolved before the election, but there are ongoing events that bring him to mind as a victim. And I think that is part of the current support for him, that he is perceived to be this victim. And lastly, I want to talk about the Latino vote. This has been an increasingly important part of coalitions, particularly in the border states. And it is not clear to me that the Latino vote is really not anymore a guarantee for either side. I think it is really very much up for grabs, and that the conduct of the election will determine where the Latino vote is going to come down. It doesn't matter in states perhaps like California. It doesn't matter in maybe very much in states like Texas, but it will matter in states like Arizona. It will matter in states like New Mexico. So I think that that Maria is right, that the Mexico-related issues are not the only force that's going to determine the outcome of this election, but they are, I think, a significant part of it. And so that's why we're here today.
Thank you, Kate. Already Pablo Cervantes asked us a question, but please, again, we're waiting for your questions. Sergio Alcocer, the floor is yours. What would you ask our panelists about Mexico, or whatever you want to ask them?
Well, I think what Pablo is asking an interesting question, and then we can move to Mexico, is what would be the role of the influence of China in this election? Because there are similar positions from both candidates, but with subtle differences. So what do you think would be the role of China? Not China itself, but the topic of China in the election.
Let me jump in, and I'd love to hear what the ambassador and Kate have to say. But I think for Biden, and what he will be stressing will be the way in which his policies, the investment, chip manufacturing, those as a way of talking about China, but about bringing manufacturing jobs back. So it's caught up in the economy and a manufacturing policy, I think probably will be the direction and have the most relevance to those voters who care about China. They're probably caring about it in terms of jobs, but I'd be curious.
Yeah,
Thank you, Maria. Chris?
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I mean, I think one of President Trump's great accomplishments is that he was really the first one to blow the whistle on China. Our foreign policy establishment in the United States had long labored under the view that, well, as China develops economically, they will their political system will reform and we'll all be friends. I think it became very clear over the years, but our foreign policy establishment was very slow to recognize this, that was not the way things were going. And I actually think that President Trump's tough policies on China are probably the single most important policy that he announced that Biden did not attempt to reverse. And I think there is a pretty broad consensus now across American politics that China is an important strategic competitor, and that competition encompasses the whole globe. Obviously, that has a particular relevance for the U.S.-Mexico relationship, which was highlighted during the pandemic, that we have so many supply chains that are now in China. And I think hopefully we can all agree that that is not a positive or helpful situation for the United States. And I think it's great if jobs come back to the United States. That's the best. But I think there's a lot of opportunities for Mexico to have jobs come back there. When I was ambassador, people talked a lot about nearshoring, friendshoring, but frankly, I was frustrated that not more was actually happening. I think I've just been in Mexico recently. I think there's a lot more happening there. I think that's very positive for both the United States and Mexico. And so I think that's it. I'd like to see that trend, frankly, get deeper. And, frankly, no country was hurt more by the rise of China starting in the 1990s than Mexico. I mean, Mexico was poised to really take off after, NAFTA entered into force in the early 1990s, and China got a lot of that. So again, I think this is an area where the U.S. and Mexico should be really walking in lockstep. And I think there's a broad recognition on both sides of the border that, we're on the same team now, and China is a competitor, and we got to work together.
Thank you, Chris. Kate?
Kathleen.
Well, China is a competitor and we should work together, but China is also an opportunity for Mexico to diversify its sources of investment. And I think that the nearshoring phenomenon could also take a form where Chinese investment, as we are starting to see, is really increasing into Mexico. And as we have seen in Africa and other cases, this is something that I think the United States will find a difficult situation. that if the United States is seeing nearshoring taking place with Chinese companies locating firms in Mexico and taking advantage of free trade rules under the USMCA, that could be a situation in which the interests of Mexico and the United States would not converge.
Could I hop in on that? Because I think that's really an excellent point that I've been trying to make recently. I actually took my first ride in a Chinese electric vehicle a few weeks ago when I was in Mexico City. I was surprised how many Chinese electric vehicles I saw there. And I know that this is just the beginning of a push. I think Mexico has to be, frankly, extremely careful, given that the USMCA or COMEXI is up for renewal in 2 years, that there is not a perception that Kate just alluded to that China is using the free trade agreement between the United States and Mexico as a backdoor to avoid the tariffs that were imposed by Trump and continued by Biden. I think the people who study the U.S.-Mexico relationship should not take for granted that USMCA will be rubber stamped and continued. And I think this, in my view, is a dagger at the heart of the USMCA. I think it will be very challenging to make a case for renewal if there's the perception that China is taking advantage of this. So again, just a note of caution for people who care about this.
Just to provide some numbers of what the ambassador said, there are 15 new companies, Chinese companies in Mexico selling their cars, and they have taken about 10% of the market share, and they are expecting to take some more, so 5% more, so 15 total. So that's the challenge that other firms in Mexico have vis-a-vis the Chinese cars. So just providing some numbers of what you said, Ambassador. We're talking about the U.S.-Mexico relation. Yesterday, President Biden mentioned 13 times her previous predecessor, and he, without mentioning his name. But he didn't mention Mexico, but Mexico was in the room. When he talked about fentanyl, everybody thought about Mexico. When he talked about irregular migration, everybody thought about Mexico, most probably. And when he talked about the border, Mexico was there. So what would be the role of Mexico in the campaign? Not the active role of my country, but I mean the concept of Mexico in the campaign, and particularly in these three topics, and fentanyl, in general, security issues, and the border and the migration issues. What would be, do you think, the role that it will have? And do you think that both are going to be using or bashing against Mexico like candidate Trump did 4 or a little bit more than 4 years ago?
Let me jump in. I think Trump will use it as a negative. I think Biden, first off, Mexico, as in all of the trade issues that we were just talking about, that's not going to be part of the discussion, I don't believe. I think on the Biden side, it will be more in terms of the what he's doing on immigration, how he really put the blame for the failure of the immigration compromise on the Republican shoulders, and he's going to use that, and I think quite effectively. What's unfortunate, at least from my perspective, is that, as we were talking about earlier, there is such an opportunity for Mexico to develop and increase its middle class, the growth with this nearshoring and friendshoring. And what I'm concerned about is that American companies, American investors, are increasingly, I believe, concerned about security, safety, rule of law in Mexico, that they'll look for other places to invest. And that is actually going to be very damaging for the long-term relationship, because these two countries are inextricably tied, not just because we have a shared community, right? 60+% of the Hispanics in the United States have their origin from Mexico. So there's deep connection. So I'm worried that the only time Mexico will come up will be drugs, fentanyl, and immigration, and the depth of the relationship is not going to get the attention. But I trust that if we have a Biden administration, that that deeper relationship will get attention.
Yes, for example, what do you think about, for example, migration? Do you think that's going to be a settled topic?
Yeah, in my view, there is no question that the border will be probably the most important issue in this election, if not, along with the economy and maybe there'll be some other big international. It's clearly gonna be one of the top three. I think though, we have to remember now that the border is not just a bilateral US-Mexico issue anymore. The issues have changed dramatically, really over the past 10 years or so, that the number of Mexicans are often in the minority of people who are actually crossing the US-Mexico border. So this is a global phenomenon, and I think needs to be addressed by the United States globally and not as an issue just on the bilateral relationship with Mexico. I think, obviously you see, and those of you in Mexico know this very well. You can look out the window and see who's on the streets. I mean, there are millions of people from all over the world coming to Mexico in an attempt to come into the United States, right? Bangladesh, Congo, Venezuela, Cuba, Brazil, Ukraine, you name it. Okay, it's like the United Nations there on the border. And so, I don't think that this is a question about bashing Mexico. In fact, during the Trump administration, we actually had very good relations with Mexico on these issues because I think Mexico realized this kind of uncontrolled migratory flow is not in Mexico's interest either. I think as ambassador, I certainly was trying to focus on win-win situations where it is in everybody's interest to get control of this and come up with legal and controlled frameworks as opposed to, caravans and all this stuff. And I think President Trump understands that. And I think he worked well with Mexico. My recent discussions in Mexico lead me to believe there's a willingness in Mexico to work with him should he be reelected. So I think these flows, frankly, and again, we come from different political views here on this call. That's great. That's the way it should be. But, in my view, this is the result of a few policy decisions by the Biden administration, and those can be changed. I think they should be changed. And I think this is a crisis that can be contained relatively quickly. And then we can start focusing on things like economic prosperity and security.
Just Kathleen, before you got jump into this, but for the average American, I think this sort of explanation that the ambassador gave us, and which I understand, and I agree with him, that the border is not only U.S.-Mexico, but has other components coming in from Africa. But I don't think the average American understands that. I was listening yesterday to Senator Katie Britt from Alabama in responding to the State of the Union address, and pretty much implied Mexico being responsible of what is happening in not only regular migration, but security and flows of drugs and all that. He talks about cartels. She talked about cartels. So I wonder if for the average American there is this difference in the role of Mexico, because I don't think that's there, and I think that Mexico is going to be sort of responsible or be assigned all the responsibilities. I don't know, Kathleen, what do you think?
Well, I do teach a class on U.S.-Mexican relations, and my students don't know that this is really no longer simply a Mexico phenomenon. I think that Mexico has certainly an interest in working with whoever is elected in the United States to stem the flow of migrants into Mexico. Because if there is some version of a remain in Mexico policy and a militarization of the border, which seems increasingly likely, regardless of who wins, I think that has clear negative impacts on Mexico, and that it will be in Mexico's interest to try to work with the United States to stop people from getting into Mexico in the first place in order to migrate to the north, because I think that there's a good chance, regardless of who is elected, that this will be a problem. But I don't think that the campaign will really expose the nuances of that situation. I think there's there was a famous saying when Bill Clinton was running for office, it's the economy, stupid, right? You know, boil it down for the American voter into something simple. And I think that's likely to happen when it comes to the issue of immigration. There are certainly many people who understand the nuances, but I don't think the average American voter does. And if you look, for example, at the Texas primary, which just happened on Tuesday, in the counties along the border, Trump did much better than average, and Biden did much worse than average, right? So Biden and Trump have both visited the Texas border recently, right? This is going to be an issue about the Mexican border and who's coming across the Mexican border. And the failures of the Biden administration are going to be highlighted as much as they can be by the Trump campaign. So I think that there will be a simplification process in the process of the campaign, which is going to feel really ugly to a lot of people who care about the issue of immigration.
Yeah. We have a couple of questions, and they are related one to each other. One is asking what will be the influence advertently or inadvertently of President López Obrador in the U.S. election. And the second question has to do with we will have a female president most likely in Mexico, either Xochitl Gálvez or Claudia Sheinbaum. What will be the relation with either one of them with the Biden administration, the new Biden administration, or a new Trump administration, if you care to think about this?
You know, I'm biased only because Sheinbaum got her graduate degree from Berkeley. but I think I don't imagine a real stark difference between either of them vis-a-vis the United States, because the set of issues remain the same, which is how to manage migration at the US-Mexico border, what to do about the cartels and fentanyl. And so I just said it's exciting for me to think that Mexico will have a female president before the United States does. But beyond that, I think if it were Biden administration, I think there will be real opportunities to deal with some of the nuances that Kate was talking about. I'm worried that if it's the Trump administration, I hope that it can be positive, as Chris says from before, but pretty hard.
I think that's a natural segue to me, Maria. and I have said, and I continue to say, there cannot be a healthy relationship between the U.S. and Mexico as long as the border is in disarray. Right at bottom, that border which unites us also divides us, and we need to get that under control. As long as we're spending this time talking about migration, fentanyl, as opposed to talking about positive things. I mean, as ambassador, I kept getting dragged into all of the, what I call like the negative issues where, it's just trying to stop a problem as opposed to focusing on the opportunity issues that I think offer so much for both sides, where there's all these win-win solutions. I will say, you mentioned AMLO, and, I think the predictions were, of course, that when AMLO came in, that, he and Trump would be like this, and U.S.-Mexico relations would be a disaster. That didn't happen. Okay, I was ambassador there. Like, I know this firsthand as well as anybody. And those of you on this call, who were observers of the relationship, could see that, AMLO and Trump got along fine. They focused on areas in which they agreed, and both of them are kind of anti-establishment insurgents within their political environments, and actually found a lot of common ground and mutual respect. That's why, the U.S.-Mexico relationship under Trump, notwithstanding all of the naysayers, was actually, I think a positive one, where we focused, we got the trade agreement updated and renegotiated. There was unprecedented cooperation on the border. For the first time, Mexico itself was enforcing its own migration laws. And Trump recognizes that. So I think President Trump sees Mexico as someone who he can cut a deal with, and that's what he did the last time. So, I think, the fentanyl issues, I think are going to require a lot of introspection on both sides of the border. We are in a very long-standing pattern of pointing the finger at each other and just saying, it's your fault. No, it's your fault. And meanwhile, the bad guys are getting away with literally murder. So, I've expressed my own views on that. I think that's going to call for a major change, frankly, in the way the U.S. government and bureaucracy approach the problem, which has long been focused on, we got to catch the bad guys in Mexico and extradite them to the United States. I mean, as ambassador, that was 95% of what we were doing in our cooperation with Mexico on fentanyl. I thought that was absurd. Like, I think we should be working with Mexico on port security, on regulation of fentanyl and precursors. And there's a lot of positive ways to move this. But if you let the forces of inertia that have not solved the problem for 40 years continue, we will not obviously get a better solution. So I don't think that is a political issue. Hopefully, I don't suspect there's going to be disagreement on that. But that, for me, was a big challenge just with the bureaucratic forces within the U.S. government, frankly. And there are corresponding ones in Mexico that I would rather, again, blame the other side than actually do something.
Thank you. Kathleen, you want to comment? And you think the gender issue would be something to watch? Because former President Trump has kind of a record of having some gender issues. So I wonder if that would be something that could be significant if he wins, and having either Xochitl or Claudia on the other side of the table.
And let me, sorry, Kate, sorry for interrupting, but let me emphasize this, because today is the International Women's Day. This is, there's going to be huge marches in Mexico City, and we know that, it's the relationship between Donald Trump and women has not been the best of the world, as with AMLO, the same. So let me press you a little bit of that. How will that mean a female president in Mexico dealing, let's say, with Trump? So, Kate, to you.
Well, if I may put on my hat as a scholar of the Mexican left, I remember when AMLO was elected, there were, I was interviewed a number of times about, well, what's he going to do? Is he crazy? And I'm like, no, he's pragmatic. He's going to figure out a way to get along with Trump. And that's exactly what happened. And I think the same thing will happen regardless of whether it's Claudia or Xochitl who's elected. I think they're going to figure out a way to get along with whoever is elected in the United States. Do I think that the gender of the president of Mexico is going to have an effect? I kind of do. I just think that there is a tendency for some people to think they can push around a woman faster than they can push around a man. But I also think that both Claudia and Xochitl are tough as nails, and they're going to be in a position to say no. I think that it's probably worth mentioning that the election day of the United States is in November, and the inauguration day of the Mexican president this year is going to be in October. So before the election, Mexico will already have a new president. And I think that we will be able to see, to some extent, how the candidates deal with that in their the last month of the campaign and what's going to happen. It will be a challenge for whoever the new president is in Mexico to try to navigate that period of time when Mexico will be most likely vilified as the campaign winds down.
Thank you, Kate. Chris, you obviously are, and it's evident in your responses, a professional, a top lawyer in the U.S. You were a clerk at the Supreme Court, and your Spanish is impeccable. Your dad was a diplomat. So you really did a beautiful job, I would say so, for U.S.-Mexican relations. You were working for the U.S. I'm a little worried about Trump 2.0. There's some analysis out there saying that Trump will be more radical, that he will appoint only loyal people. So as someone who worked for Trump, but above all, you're a very sophisticated policymaker and diplomat. would you say that Trump will radicalize or will be, or what to expect? And yes.
President Trump has always seemed to conjure up these horrible images in the minds of his opponents. I mean, again, he has now been president. He was president for 4 years, so we know that. I was proud to be part of that administration, and I think we got a lot done, notwithstanding everybody, who was opposed to President Trump saying, "Oh my God, he's going to be terrible." They're now starting like, "Oh my gosh, well, he was maybe not been terrible the first time, but he certainly will be terrible the second time." Again, I think that's politics, right? People are going to say that. I think, frankly, President Trump is a deal maker. I do not see him wanting to vilify Mexico. I see him approaching Mexico in this campaign as saying, something, I actually got a deal done with Mexico the last time, and we worked together again. And if I'm president again, we will work with Mexico just as closely. We'll cut a deal with Mexico. And so again, I don't I don't buy into all the doom and gloom. Again, we've already seen that movie, right? Again, politics is going to be what it is. I just think there is always a narrative on President Trump that he's some kind of particular monster that is uniquely dangerous. Okay, like that's the political narrative. Like I understand that, but to me that's all it is. And again, I think, frankly, there's a lot of opportunities in the U.S.-Mexico relationship. I don't think anybody can look at the U.S.-Mexico relationship these last 4 years with Biden and say, "Oh my gosh, things are just going terrific. Like this is great." I think, again, this is, particularly from my perspective, it's been very painful for me to see a lot of the policies that we put into place immediately reversed on day one. I could have told you we were going to have all this crisis at the border. This was totally obvious to me. Okay, and this is not helpful to Mexico. Okay, so I think hopefully there's people in Mexico who are sophisticated enough not to fall for the same old line of, "Oh my God, Trump's a monster and he's going to be your worst enemy. He's the monster hiding under your bed. So be very careful." Again, I read articles like that. I get it, but again, I don't buy that.
Maria.
I just want to say, I agree with Chris vis-a-vis Mexico. Whether it's Biden or Trump, it's not going to be the world falling in. However, it's like the tail of the dog. For the United States as a country, the chaos, the breaking of norms, the plans this is an existential election for the United States. And just want to remind, really, we had President Trump when the pandemic hit. There are many questions that arose for how that was handled, the lives that were lost. So yes, from the Mexico, we're here at a U.S.-Mexico. Probably from Mexico's perspective, the challenge, there's opportunities. But from what is going to happen in the United States, that is the subject probably of another forum.
Maria and I can debate that separately. We can talk about all the criminal indictments against President Trump, an attempt to put him in jail, whatever. We can discuss that. That's what democracy is.
And certainly there's 2 lawyers here, top lawyers.
We can't help it. We're trained, we're programmed to argue. It's in our DNA.
Well, and there are only 90 accounts, so I mean that will be a lot up to discuss. Kathleen.
Well, academics are trained to say on the one hand, on the other hand, without getting into what Trump would do to the United States. I do think that the issue of immigration in the campaign is going to be different than the issue of immigration in a Trump or Biden presidency. I think that there are good reasons for the U.S. and Mexico to try to work together because, as we've already mentioned, the problem of immigration is no longer simply a Mexico-U.S. problem. if it ever really was. And I also wonder whether the issue of drugs will become more important in the campaign. And I say this because of where the swing states are. Swing states that Biden won last time, like Michigan or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. These are areas where there's not a whole lot of concern about immigration, but there is concern about fentanyl. And so I do wonder whether that might not prove to be an advantageous hook for the candidates to try to talk about, well, what are we going to do? What are you going to do about fentanyl? If this becomes an issue, then I think that Mexico would again become part of the conversation. Unfortunately, not in terms of what fentanyl and the drug trafficking are doing to Mexico, which I think is an equally important aspect of the problem, if not more important. But in terms of how do we stop the flow of drugs from Mexico to the United States? And again, there's what is the obvious solution? It's again the border, and I think Ambassador Landau is right about that the border is linked in trade and immigration and in drugs.
But I bring up one point, just since I'm sorry, Maria. We brought you go first. You go first.
No, you first.
Okay, I just want to say one thing. So we're talking about I asked before this webinar, who is the audience here? And I think Rafael said a lot of people who live on the border. And one of the things that surprised me as ambassador was that people who actually live in these border communities in the San Diego area, Arizona, Texas, aren't more active in American politics in really bringing up how these kind of nuts and bolts at the border affect their lives. I mean, I was there when the pandemic started, and we shut the border to non-essential traffic, which meant you couldn't go visit your abuela who lived on the other side of the border. You couldn't go to your dentist's appointment, maybe. Like, it disrupted lives of people at the border in myriad ways that I was completely aware of. Again, we're talking now March 2020, when nobody really knew what was going on. I thought this might be a matter of a couple of weeks or months. We all did. Remember, like 2 weeks to stop the spread. I was shocked. I wanted to, starting already by the summer, I said, like, why aren't we reopening the border? There are health measures in place in terms of at least allowing people with family on the other side of the border to cross. What I was basically, the bureaucracy didn't want to do that for a variety of reasons. And frankly, it was not reopened fully until almost a year into the Biden administration in 2021. And I would just urge our listeners who are in border communities, please make your views known to your senator, representatives, to people in Washington, because you have a unique experience living on the border that policymakers in Mexico City or Washington do not have. And I felt like I couldn't want it more than you. Like, if you were not clamoring and calling your representatives every day, from my point in Mexico City, it was hard for me to basically be putting my hair on fire saying we've got to be changing things at the border. So again, this is, I hope, a nonpartisan, non-political issue. Just make your voices heard in the political process, because you have a very unique perspective on U.S.-Mexico relations. And I think it's very important.
Thank you, Chris.
I just wanted to actually pick up on that point of Kate had mentioned the Latino vote and the counties along the border that Trump has, there's more support for. The trick, whether it's migration or drugs, is for the Biden campaign I think they finally understand that the Latino community is not monolithic, and that in fact it is a swing voter. It is not part of the Democratic base the way the African American vote is. But the knee-jerk reaction is to try to treat it as the base and to talk about immigration in a way as if that's the only thing that Latinos care about, and that is not true. So I think that there is an opportunity to tease out those nuances, and I really, really agree that communities along the border need to tell their elected officials what they are experiencing and how they want government to respond because these issues are extremely, they're affecting their lives, right? But last on the migration thing, it won't happen in the campaign, but I want to be clear, our audience, migration is a world global issue, and it's not going away with climate change, with everything that is going on. And as Doris Meissner once said, you cannot control immigration. All you can do is manage it.
Right.
Manage it because human beings, a big chunk of them, will pick up and leave to look for a better life. So to manage the US-Mexico border, we collectively have to find ways to really ensure opportunity and development in the sending countries. This is not going to go away, notwithstanding the politicians who say, I fix it like this with this one regulation.
We have 5 minutes left, so I will ask you if you can use 1 minute. I know it's hard for lawyers to speak for 1 minute, but if you can do it in 1 minute, just a conclusion on this, and perhaps if you can.
Academics too. You got to give me 55 minutes for a lecture.
But
Sergio,
I
before
have a point for a lecture, but well, in 1 minute or 1.5, if you can provide some conclusions and some recommendations. I think if you were a Mexican official, what would you do vis-a-vis, let's say, a bashing of Mexico in the campaign? Is there a role that the Mexican government can do, or Mexican academics, or what would be your conclusion?
And Chris, a question for you, because I believe it's very much in the minds of a lot of Mexicans, and it's there. It's asking, do you think that Trump could militarily intervene in Mexico? He has said so, and it's just a direct question to you. Well, let's if you want to start answering that, and then do your conclusions, please.
The short answer, the short answer to that specific question is no. I certainly believe that it would be extremely unwise. To me, the calls for that are an outgrowth of the very militarized thinking about the counter-narcotic strategy in general. The DEA-driven, we've got to catch the bad guys and extradite them. Okay, the Mexicans aren't catching the bad guys, so now we have to catch the bad guys in Mexico and extradite them. I just think that's fundamentally a losing strategy. I think anybody who studied the issue, in my experience, also thinks that's a losing strategy, that you cut the head off the snake has 5 heads, right? I mean, Chapo was sitting there in prison, but the Sinaloa cartel is still alive and kicking. So I have my issues, as you can tell, with the American approach to this. And frankly, I think anything like that would make the situation far worse. And I think President Trump understands that. But I think there's a frustration in Washington, and this goes back to some of the issues we've been discussing, that Mexico has, whether it's fair or not, that on migration and on drugs, that Mexico is not doing everything that Mexico needs to do. Again, I think we can work with Mexico on these issues. I think we need to kind of come up with fresh thinking about how to handle some of these issues. But I think the opportunities are there, and I thought Maria made a very good point, and Kate as well. Like the Latino vote in the United States is a critical vote, and it's a vote that is up for grabs. And I think that is actually super valuable and helpful to the Latino community in the United States, because a vote that is up for grabs is a vote that's going to get a lot of attention from politicians. Nobody's taking that vote for granted. And, again, I do not, your question kind of started with, bashing Mexico. I personally, I'm not involved with the campaign, so I can't say what the campaign is going to do, but I would be very doubtful that there is going to be this bashing campaign, because I think, for me, President Trump can actually say, I got the deal done with Mexico, and it was Biden who undid the things that we had done to get control of the situation. And I want to go back to what I had done and work with the colleagues in Mexico. I mean, let's not forget AMLO's first foreign trip as president was to the White House under President Trump in July of 2020. So he and Trump, can get a deal. And I suspect that is true with him and Claudia. And I think that's the way he's going to be thinking about that campaign in a second term. Sorry, I think I went way over. I apologize.
Yes, yes, indeed. Maria, please.
Let me say that I think that if I were a Mexican elected official, I would really be taking a hard look. Like Mexico has so many resources. It has a population. It's focusing on its internal development. It has now under previous presidents tried one way to deal with the drugs cartels, tried another way. What is the internal strategy for really tackling that? And what does it need from the US to be effective, right? So that would be my number one, because without that sense of security, which is permeating the countryside, I can tell you from my own little village where we have property, the word on the street is the narcos have moved in, but it's okay because their families live here, so nothing's going to happen here. This is horrible. So that would be my number one. What is it that you are doing in your country to make it the kind of robust society that can be a true partner with the US and not be the focus of the bashing? That would be my number one. What can you in Mexico do to be that partner and then those of us in the States like me will focus on educating our American people that Mexico is an ally and a friend for the future, and that together we can actually have a very positive future.
Thank you, Maria. Kathleen, please.
I'll try to be very brief. I would simply say to a Mexican official that the Mexican president will be decided before the US president is decided. And whoever is elected, their best option is to continue to make contacts, not only with the presidential campaigns of both candidates, but with those who will remain in office regardless of who wins the presidency, with governors, with mayors along the border, because a lot of policy gets made at the local level, not just the national level. And so I think that there will be more continuity, despite the fact that the presidential election is, of course, very consequential, and that Mexican officials need to make sure that they're maintaining those contacts within the bureaucracy, within the local governments, and within the states.
Thank you very much. I think it has been a fascinating discussion and hearing from you. I think we have learned a lot. And I think the very first lesson is that this is going to be a very different campaign. And so we have to learn how these two parties who have changed quite a bit will also sort of mimic into this campaign. So Rafa, thank you very much, Maria, Chris, and Kathleen, and Rafa, for your
Thank you all. It went beautiful. And of course, the only thing we need is more time. With that, we'll have you guys back. And thanks a lot for participating and for being so candid in your views. Thank you very much.